Somewhere in the white desert of southern New Mexico, there are footprints. Not fossils, not impressions left by some unknown creature. Human footprints. The feet of adults and teenagers and small children pressed into wet mud beside the tracks of giant ground sloths and mammoths. And when researchers finally dated those prints, the number that came back was not 10,000 years, not 12,000, 21,000 years minimum, possibly 23,000. That single result threatened to rewrite the entire timeline of how and when human beings first set foot in the Americas. And it was only the beginning, because New Mexico, as it turns out, is full of things that don't quite fit the version of history most of us were taught. A road built with astonishing precision that appears to lead nowhere. A calendar made not from stone or metal, but from carefully positioned blades of sunlight. Pottery deliberately destroyed before being buried with the dead. Turquoise mines operating on an industrial scale centuries before any European knew this land existed. One of the oldest wells ever found in the Western Hemisphere, and it may never have actually worked. A debris field that launched the most famous UFO story in modern history, even though the real explanation involves something arguably just as strange. Rock drawings so faint they went unnoticed for decades, preserving a record of warfare that official histories barely acknowledged. And an entire ancient settlement, invisible to the naked eye, revealed only when someone flew over it with a thermal camera. 9 discoveries, all documented, all real, and every single one of them asks a question that still doesn't have a comfortable answer. Let's start in the place where history had to be rewritten in the most literal way possible, one footprint at a time. White Sands is not what most people picture when they think of an archaeological site. There are no crumbling walls, no broken pottery scattered across the ground. What there is, stretching across a vast area of what is now White Sands National Park in southern New Mexico, is an ancient lake bed. During the last ice age, this region looked nothing like the pale, flat desert visitors see today. It was wetter, cooler. A large body of water called Lake Otero filled parts of the basin, and along its shores and across its muddy margins, animals and people walked, leaving tracks in the soft, damp sediment. Over thousands of years, those tracks were buried under layers of additional sediment. The lake shrank, the climate dried, the surface hardened, and for millennia, nobody knew the footprints were there. The discovery wasn't a single dramatic moment. Tracks had been noticed in the area for years, some exposed by wind erosion, others spotted during surveys. But the real breakthrough came when researchers from the U.S. Geological Survey, the National Park Service, and several universities began systematically documenting and dating the prints. What they found was staggering. Entire trackways, meaning continuous sequences of footprints left by individuals walking across the landscape. Adults, adolescents, children? One trackway in particular attracted enormous attention. It recorded what appeared to be a person walking a considerable distance across wet ground with an uneven gait, the kind of stride pattern consistent with carrying a heavy, shifting load. At certain points along the path, smaller prints appeared beside the larger ones, then vanished again. The most straightforward interpretation was that someone had been carrying a small child, occasionally setting the child down, then picking them up and continuing. It is an extraordinarily human image, frozen in mud for over 20,000 years. But researchers are careful to note that what they can actually demonstrate is the physical evidence, the asymmetric gait, the intermittent appearance of child-sized prints alongside the adult trackway. The emotional narrative we attach to it is inference. Reasonable inference, but inference. The dating is where the real controversy began. The initial ages were obtained using radiocarbon dating of seeds from Rupia serosa, a species of aquatic plant, found embedded in the same sediment layers as the footprints. Those seeds returned dates clustering between roughly 21,000 and 23,000 years ago. And that number was a problem, a big one. For decades, the dominant model in American archaeology held that the first people to enter the Americas were the Clovis culture, named after a site in eastern New Mexico where distinctive stone tools were found in the 1930s. The Clovis first model placed human arrival at roughly 13,000 to 13,500 years ago. Over time, that date had already been pushed back somewhat. Pre-Clovis sites like Monteverde in Chile had gained acceptance, nudging the timeline to perhaps 15,000 or 16,000 years. But 21,000 years? That was not a minor adjustment. That was nearly doubling the known time frame. It meant humans were in the Americas during the last glacial maximum, the coldest, harshest phase of the last ice age, when massive ice sheets covered much of northern North America. The conventional assumption had been that those ice sheets would have blocked any migration route from Asia. If people were already at White Sands 21,000 years ago, they must have arrived even earlier, and they must have found a way south that did not require waiting for the ice to melt. The skepticism was immediate and, in fairness, scientifically appropriate. The main concern focused on the rupia seeds themselves. Aquatic plants can absorb dissolved ancient carbon from the water they grow in, a phenomenon known as the hard water effect, or freshwater reservoir effect. If the seeds had incorporated old carbon from the lake water, their radiocarbon age would appear older than their true age. Critics argued that the footprints might actually be several thousand years younger than the seed dates suggested, which would bring them closer to the already accepted pre-Clovis range and remove the need for such a dramatic rewrite. The research team anticipated this objection. In follow-up studies published over the next 2 years, they applied additional dating methods. One involved radiocarbon dating of terrestrial pollen grains, specifically conifer pollen, extracted from the same stratigraphic layers. Pollen from land plants does not suffer from the freshwater reservoir effect. Those dates confirmed the original range. Another approach used optically stimulated luminescence dating on quartz grains in the sediment, measuring when those grains were last exposed to sunlight. Again, the results were consistent. 3 independent dating methods, each with different potential sources of error, converged on the same conclusion. The footprints were genuinely ancient. The implications are still being absorbed by the field. If humans were present in what is now New Mexico more than 20,000 years ago, the entire framework for understanding the peopling of the Americas needs to accommodate a much earlier arrival. It raises questions about migration routes, about whether people came by a coastal path, about how small populations survived in an Ice Age landscape, and about how many other early sites might exist but remain undiscovered. White Sands did not answer all of those questions. What it did was prove that the questions need to be asked. And here is one detail that often gets lost in the headlines. The human tracks at White Sands are not alone. In the same broad landscape, researchers have documented footprints from Columbian mammoths, giant ground sloths, dire wolves, camels, and other Pleistocene megafauna. In some cases, human and animal tracks occur in the same sediment horizons. The picture that emerges is not of isolated visitors passing through once. It is of people living in a landscape alongside animals that have been extinct for thousands of years, walking the same mudflats, sharing the same water sources, coexisting. That image alone would be remarkable. The fact that it is written in footprints, in the simplest and most direct evidence imaginable, is what makes White Sands unlike almost any other archaeological site on Earth. Now, roughly 450 miles to the northwest, in the high desert of the San Juan Basin, another mystery sits in the open, visible from satellite images, mapped with aerial photography, and still not fully explained. It is not hidden underground. It is not locked behind a laboratory door. It is a road. And the strange thing about it is where it goes. Chaco Canyon is one of the most studied archaeological sites in North America. Between roughly 850 and 1150 CE, the ancestral Puebloan people built a complex of massive stone buildings there, the so-called Great Houses, some rising 4 or 5 stories and containing hundreds of rooms. Pueblo Bonito, the most famous, had an estimated 600 rooms and covered more than 2 acres. The construction required enormous quantities of timber, stone, and labor, all coordinated in a harsh, arid environment. Chaco was clearly a place of immense importance, whether as a political center, a ceremonial hub, a pilgrimage destination, or some combination of all 3. Researchers have debated its exact function for decades, but the Great Houses are not the only puzzle in the landscape. Radiating outward from Chaco Canyon in multiple directions, archaeologists identified a system of ancient roads. Not trails, not paths worn gradually by foot traffic. Roads, deliberately constructed, impressively straight, and in many cases far wider than anything practical transportation would require. Some measured 9 meters across, roughly 30 feet, wide enough for a modern 2-lane highway. They were built by clearing vegetation, scraping down the surface, and in some cases cutting through ridges or building up low spots to maintain a remarkably consistent grade. Where they encountered obstacles, the builders sometimes constructed ramps, staircases carved into rock, or raised earthen berms. The road system was first recognized through a combination of aerial photography and ground survey beginning in the 1970s and 1980s. From the air, the roads appeared as faint linear features crossing the desert, sometimes visible only under certain light conditions or after rain slightly darkened the old roadbed. On the ground, many were nearly invisible. The total network may have extended over 300 miles, connecting Chaco to outlying communities across the region. But the most enigmatic segment is the one called the Great North Road. The Great North Road runs almost perfectly straight, heading north from Pueblo Alto, one of the great houses on the rim of Chaco Canyon. It extends for roughly 50 miles across open, difficult terrain. And here is the problem. It does not clearly connect to a major settlement at its northern end. Parts of it appear to terminate near the edge of Coots Canyon, a dramatic sandstone gorge. There are some outlying sites in the general area, but nothing on the scale that would obviously justify the construction of such a massive, meticulously engineered road. This is the detail that has puzzled researchers for decades. If you build a road that wide and that straight across 50 miles of desert, you presumably have a destination. But the Great North Road does not behave like a practical transportation route. Its width is excessive for foot traffic. Its straightness, maintained at the cost of considerable labor to cut through terrain features, suggests that geometric precision mattered more than following the easiest path, and its apparent endpoint is, to put it bluntly, puzzling. Several explanations have been proposed. One is purely practical. The road connected Chaco to timber sources or communities to the north, and the segments leading to the actual destination simply have not survived or have not yet been found. Another is that the road had a ceremonial or cosmological function. In many Pueblo and oral traditions, the north is associated with the place of origin, the direction from which people emerged into the present world. Some archaeologists have suggested that the Great North Road was not built to go somewhere in the physical sense, but to connect Chaco symbolically to a spiritual geography. A third possibility is that the road served both functions, or that its purpose changed over time. What makes this question so difficult to resolve is that the ancestral Puebloans left no written records. Their descendants, the modern Pueblo peoples, maintain oral traditions that may contain relevant knowledge, but those traditions are often considered sacred and are not always shared publicly. The archaeological evidence alone can tell us that the road was built, how it was built, and where it runs. It cannot tell us with certainty why. What can be said is that the Chaco road system, and the Great North Road in particular, represents a level of landscape engineering that is difficult to reconcile with the image of small, isolated farming communities. Someone organized the labor, planned the geometry, and decided that maintaining a straight line mattered enough to justify enormous effort. Whether the destination was a place on the map or a place in the cosmos remains one of the most genuinely open questions in southwestern archaeology. And if you think a road to nowhere is strange, consider what happens when you climb to the top of a butte inside the canyon itself and watch what sunlight does at exactly the right moment of the year. Fajada Butte rises about 135 meters above the floor of Chaco Canyon, an isolated sandstone formation visible from much of the surrounding landscape. Near its summit, in a spot that is difficult to reach and not visible from below, 3 large stone slabs lean against the cliff face. Behind those slabs, on the rock wall itself, someone carved 2 spiral petroglyphs. One is larger, the other smaller. They are not random scratches. They are carefully executed spirals with consistent geometry. In 1977, an artist named Anna Sofer was surveying rock art in Chaco Canyon when she climbed Fajada Butte and noticed something unusual near these slabs. Close to midday on the summer solstice, a narrow dagger-shaped beam of sunlight passed between 2 of the leaning stones and fell directly onto the larger spiral, bisecting it vertically near its center. The effect lasted only a few minutes before the sun's angle changed and the light moved away. Sofer returned at the winter solstice and observed something different. 2 beams of light appeared, one on each side of the large spiral, framing it. At the equinoxes, the light pattern shifted again, with a beam crossing the larger spiral off-center and a separate beam bisecting the smaller spiral. Over the course of a year, the interplay of sunlight, shadow, and stone produced a sequence of distinct patterns that corresponded precisely to the major stations of the solar year. The discovery became known as the Sun Dagger, and it drew immediate scientific attention. Researchers documented the light patterns with photography, film, and precise measurements of the angles involved. The correlations were too specific to be coincidental. The spirals were positioned exactly where the light would fall. The question was whether the stone slabs themselves had been deliberately placed by people to create this effect, or whether ancient observers had found a naturally occurring arrangement of rocks that produced useful light patterns and then added the spirals to mark and formalize what nature provided. This question has never been fully resolved. The slabs are large and heavy. Moving them into position on a steep, narrow ledge near the top of a butte would have been a serious physical challenge, though not an impossible one. Some researchers lean toward intentional placement. Others argue that the slabs fell naturally into approximately their current position, and that the real ingenuity lay in recognizing the optical possibilities and carving the spirals in precisely the right spots. Either interpretation requires sophisticated astronomical knowledge and careful observation over multiple seasons. There is also evidence, debated but intriguing, that the site may have tracked lunar cycles as well, specifically the 18.6-year cycle of the Moon's standstill positions. If confirmed, this would represent an even more complex level of astronomical monitoring. And then came the loss. Sometime after the site was documented and began attracting visitors, the stone slabs shifted. Erosion of the supporting sediment, possibly accelerated by foot traffic on the butte, caused the rocks to move enough to alter the geometry. The Sun Dagger no longer functions as it did when Sofer first recorded it. The summer solstice light no longer bisects the spiral with the same precision. The site has been closed to public access since 1989 to prevent further damage, but the original configuration is gone. What remains are the photographs, films, and measurements taken before the shift, and the spirals themselves, still carved into the rock, still waiting for light that no longer arrives at quite the right angle. What makes the Sun Dagger extraordinary is not that ancient people watched the sky. Many cultures did. What makes it extraordinary is the elegance of the method. No moving parts, no mechanical components, just stone, shadow, and the predictable motion of the Earth around the sun, combined into a system that marked the passage of the year with a blade of light on a spiral carved into a cliff. It is difficult to stand in front of that idea and not feel that something important has been lost, not just at Fajada Butte, but in how we think about what counts as technology. You know what? Here is a question worth thinking about. These people tracked the sun with light and shadow on a cliff. They built roads across the desert with the straightness of a surveyor's line. They constructed buildings that aligned with astronomical events. And yet, somehow, they are still routinely described as a primitive society. What exactly does that word mean if it includes people who could do all of this? Leave your answer in the comments, because I think the assumptions we bring to that question say more about us than about them. About 200 miles south of Chaco, along the Mimbres River in southwestern New Mexico, a different culture left behind something equally puzzling, but much smaller and much more personal. The Mimbres people, a branch of the broader Mogollon tradition, flourished roughly between 1000 and 1150 CE. They are best known today for their pottery, specifically their black-on-white painted bowls. And these bowls are genuinely remarkable. The painted images include geometric designs, but also an astonishing range of figurative scenes. Fish, insects, birds, rabbits, bighorn sheep, human figures, composite creatures that blend animal and human features, and narrative scenes that appear to depict hunts, ceremonies, or mythological episodes. The quality of the draftsmanship is striking. These are not crude scratches, they are confident, fluid compositions painted with mineral pigments on carefully shaped and fired vessels. But the bowls are most famous for how they were treated after they were made. Hundreds of Mimbres bowls have been found in burial contexts, typically placed over the head or face of the deceased, and the vast majority of those burial bowls share one distinctive feature: a hole, usually circular, punched through the bottom of the vessel, often directly through the center of the painted image. These are the so-called kill holes. Archaeologists can determine that the holes were made deliberately, before burial, rather than resulting from post-depositional damage. The edges of the holes show fracture patterns consistent with a forceful blow from inside the vessel while the clay was already fully hardened. The breaks radiate outward in a way that indicates intentional percussion, not the random cracking caused by soil pressure, root intrusion, or the weight of overlying sediment. In many cases, the removed disc of clay was found inside the bowl or nearby in the grave, confirming that the hole was made at the time of burial. The consistency of the practice is what makes it so compelling. This was not occasional or accidental, it was systematic. Bowl after bowl, grave after grave, the same deliberate puncture through the painted surface. It was clearly a required part of the funerary ritual. But why? The most widely cited interpretation is that the bowl was symbolically killed to release its spirit, enabling it to accompany the deceased into the afterlife or the next world. The idea has intuitive appeal and fits broadly with ethnographic analogies from other indigenous cultures in the Southwest and beyond, where objects are sometimes ritually broken or retired before being placed with the dead. Some researchers have suggested that the act of breaking through the painted image was specifically significant, as if the image itself had power or identity that needed to be freed. But here is where honesty requires a pause. We do not know what the Mimbres people believed. They left no written texts. Their descendants, to the extent they can be identified among modern Pueblo communities, do not necessarily maintain specific oral traditions about the kill hole practice. The symbolic interpretation is reasonable, widely accepted, and perhaps even likely, but it is not proven. It is an inference drawn from material evidence and cross-cultural comparison. The bowls tell us what was done. They do not tell us what it meant to the people who did it. What the bowls do tell us, unambiguously, is that the Mimbres world was one where art, death, and ritual were deeply intertwined, where a painted image was significant enough that it had to be dealt with before it could be placed in a grave. That alone is worth pausing over. Now let's move northeast, to a set of low hills that don't look like much from the road, but contain evidence of something most people never associate with prehistoric North America: mining on an almost industrial scale. The Cerrillos Hills sit about 25 miles southwest of Santa Fe. They are not dramatic mountains. They are modest, rolling formations of volcanic rock. But within and around those hills, archaeologists have documented one of the largest and most important prehistoric mining landscapes in North America. The target was turquoise. Turquoise held enormous cultural and economic value across the pre-Columbian Southwest and far beyond. It appeared in jewelry, mosaics, ritual objects, and trade goods from the deserts of New Mexico to the temples of central Mexico. And the Cerrillos Hills were one of the primary sources. Geological surveys have identified the turquoise-bearing veins within the host rock, and archaeological surveys have mapped an extensive landscape of ancient mining activity: pits, shafts, trenches, tailings piles, stone hammer fragments, and areas where raw turquoise was sorted and initially processed. The scale is difficult to appreciate without visiting. This was not a single prospector chipping at an outcrop. The mining landscape covers a significant area, with evidence of repeated, organized extraction over centuries. Some pits reach considerable depth. The work was done entirely with stone tools, primarily hammerstones made from hard cobbles. Metal tools did not exist in this region before European contact. Every kilogram of turquoise-bearing rock was broken free by striking it repeatedly with stone against stone. Estimating when different parts of the mining landscape were active is challenging. Unlike a building with datable timbers or a midden with datable charcoal, a stone quarry pit does not always contain material suitable for precise chronological methods. Researchers rely on associated artifacts, the typology of stone tools found in and around the workings, nearby habitation sites with datable deposits, and in some cases, the weathering and patination of exposed rock surfaces. The evidence indicates that mining activity at Cerrillos spans a long period, with significant extraction occurring well before 1000 CE and continuing up to and beyond the arrival of the Spanish in the 16th century. The turquoise from Cerrillos did not stay local. Geochemical analysis, particularly isotopic and trace element fingerprinting, has allowed researchers to match turquoise artifacts found at distant sites back to their geological source. Cerrillos turquoise has been identified at sites across the Southwest and in Mesoamerica, including at major centers like Chaco Canyon and possibly even as far south as the Aztec and Mixtec regions of Mexico. This means that Cerrillos was not just a mine, it was a node in a long-distance exchange network that moved a valuable material across thousands of miles, connecting cultures and economies that are often studied in isolation. The existence of large-scale mining, long-distance trade, and organized labor at Cerrillos before European arrival is not controversial. It is well documented. What it challenges is the persistent popular assumption that pre-Columbian North America lacked economic complexity. Cerrillos is proof that indigenous societies were capable of identifying a valuable resource, organizing its extraction on a significant scale, and distributing it through sophisticated trade networks that spanned half a continent. The fact that they did it all with stone tools does not diminish the achievement. If anything, it makes it more impressive. If you find this kind of buried history as fascinating as I do, take a moment to subscribe to this channel, because the deeper we look into the archaeology of the Americas, the more the simple stories we were taught start to come apart at the seams, and there is a lot more to uncover. Now, let's go back to eastern New Mexico, to a place most people know only for its connection to the Clovis culture and its famous spear points. But there is something else at Blackwater Draw that deserves far more attention than it gets. Blackwater Draw, near the town of Clovis, is one of the most important Paleo-Indian sites in North America. It was here, in the 1930s, that distinctive fluted projectile points were found in direct association with the bones of extinct Pleistocene animals, establishing the Clovis culture as the earliest widely accepted evidence of human presence in the Americas. That distinction has since been complicated by sites like White Sands, but Blackwater Draw remains foundational. What is less well known is a feature discovered during excavations that has been interpreted as a well, not a natural spring, not a pond. A deliberately dug circular pit, sunk into the ground by human hands, apparently for the purpose of reaching groundwater. The feature dates to roughly 13,500 years ago, during the late Pleistocene, when the climate was shifting and the landscape around Blackwater Draw was drying. Lakes and ponds that had sustained both animals and people were shrinking. Access to reliable water was becoming a critical survival issue. In that context, the idea that Clovis people might have tried to dig for water is not far-fetched. It is, in fact, exactly what you would expect from resourceful people facing environmental stress. The pit itself is circular in plan, with relatively steep sides, and extends downward into the underlying sediments. Its shape and dimensions are consistent with intentional excavation rather than a natural formation. The fill inside the pit contains sediment that differs from the surrounding matrix, suggesting it was backfilled or silted in after being dug. Associated materials help establish its age within the Clovis-era occupation of the site. Here is the striking part. Some researchers who have examined the feature believe that whoever dug it may never have actually reached the water table. If true, this would make it not just one of the oldest known wells in the New World, but a failed well, a dry hole, an attempt that didn't work. That might sound like a minor footnote, but think about what it actually represents. 13,500 years ago, a small group of people in a drying landscape understood that water existed beneath the surface. They had enough knowledge of their environment to know that digging down might reach it. They committed the labor to try. And they may have failed. The water table may have been deeper than they could reach with the tools they had, or the sediments may not have yielded water in sufficient quantity. We cannot be completely certain whether water was ever reached, because the evidence is ambiguous. The fill sediments inside the pit do not preserve a clear, unambiguous signature of standing water at the base. It is possible that some water was obtained before the feature was abandoned, or that the water table fluctuated seasonally. The interpretation of a dry well is a reasonable reading of the evidence, but not the only one. What is not ambiguous is the intent. Someone dug a structured pit into the ground at a time when surface water was disappearing. That act alone tells us something profound about how Clovis people understood and interacted with their environment. They were not passively wandering across the landscape, following herds and hoping for the best. They were problem solvers. Engineers in the most fundamental sense of the word. Even if this particular attempt failed, the concept behind it, that water can be obtained by modifying the earth, is one of the most important ideas in human history. And at Blackwater Draw, it may have appeared astonishingly early. Now we come to the one New Mexico mystery that everyone thinks they know, Roswell. And the truth, as it usually does, turns out to be stranger and more interesting than the myth. In early July 1947, a rancher named W. Mac Brazel found a field of unusual debris scattered across a stretch of ranch land northwest of Roswell, New Mexico. The material included metallic fragments, sticks, foil-like material, and what was described as a tough, paper-like substance. Brazel reported the find to the local sheriff, who contacted Roswell Army Airfield, then home to the 509th Bombardment Group, the only nuclear-armed military unit in the world at that time. On July 8, 1947, the Public Information Office at Roswell Army Airfield issued a press release stating that personnel had recovered a flying disc from a ranch near Roswell. The phrase appeared in newspaper headlines across the country. For a few hours, the United States military had officially announced that it had captured a flying saucer. Then, almost immediately, the story changed. Within a day, higher-ranking officials corrected the statement. The recovered material, they said, was a weather balloon. Photographs were released showing officers holding pieces of a standard-looking balloon apparatus. The story died down. For about 30 years, almost nobody talked about it. Then, in the late 1970s, researchers began interviewing witnesses and re-examining the incident. Books were published. Claims multiplied. Some witnesses, or people claiming to be witnesses, described exotic materials, strange symbols, and even recovered alien bodies. The Roswell story became the centerpiece of modern UFO mythology, growing more elaborate with each retelling. In 1994, the U.S. Air Force released a report that offered a different explanation. The debris recovered in 1947, the report concluded, was not a weather balloon in the ordinary sense. It was equipment from Project Mogul, a then-classified military program that used high-altitude balloon trains, long arrays of balloons, sensors, and reflectors launched in sequence to carry acoustic monitoring equipment to the upper atmosphere. The purpose of Project Mogul was to detect sound waves from Soviet nuclear tests. In 1947, the United States had not yet developed the satellite and seismic monitoring systems that would later make atmospheric detection unnecessary. Balloon-borne acoustic sensors were a serious and secret attempt to answer one of the most urgent intelligence questions of the early Cold War. Had the Soviets detonated a nuclear weapon? The Mogul balloons used materials that were unusual for the time, including radar reflectors made of foil-covered balsa wood sticks and a type of reinforced tape that bore decorative geometric patterns, which some witnesses later remembered as strange symbols. The balloon trains were long, some stretching hundreds of feet, and when they came down, the debris field could be extensive. The Air Force report identified a specific Mogul launch, Flight Number 4, launched from Alamogordo Army Airfield in June 1947, as the likely source of the Roswell debris. Flight 4's tracking records were lost, meaning its final location was never officially recorded, which is consistent with it having come down unrecovered on the open range. Here is what makes this story genuinely interesting, as opposed to merely sensational. The initial press release calling the debris a flying disc was not a hoax. It was a mistake made by a public information officer at a military base who did not know what Project Mogul was. The program was classified. The base personnel who recovered the debris did not recognize it because they were not cleared to know about the project that had launched it. When they saw unusual materials scattered across a field, they had no frame of reference. The quick correction from higher command was not a cover-up of aliens. It was a cover-up of a classified Cold War intelligence program. The weather balloon story was itself a cover story, but it was covering a balloon, not a spacecraft. The irony is exquisite. The secrecy that surrounded Project Mogul created exactly the conditions needed for a conspiracy theory to flourish. Witnesses knew the weather balloon explanation didn't match what they had seen because the materials really were unusual, just not extraterrestrial. The military really did change its story because the first story accidentally told the truth, and the second story was a deliberate lie designed to protect a classified program. Every ingredient for decades of suspicion was genuine. The only thing that wasn't genuine was the alien spacecraft. The debris was real, the recovery was real, the initial announcement was real, the cover-up was real. The only part that has never been supported by physical evidence is the extraterrestrial hypothesis. No recovered alien materials, bodies, or technology have ever been produced, verified, or confirmed by independent scientific analysis. What happened at Roswell in 1947 is a perfect case study in how government secrecy, institutional confusion, and human pattern seeking can combine to create a mythology that takes on a life entirely independent of the facts that started it. And speaking of things that were right in front of people's eyes but went unrecognized for years, let's head north to the basalt cliffs above the Rio Grande. The Rio Grande Gorge cuts through the volcanic landscape of northern New Mexico like a wound in the earth, dropping hundreds of feet below the surrounding plateau. The basalt walls that line the gorge are dark, hard, and covered in places with desert varnish, the dark manganese-rich coating that forms on rock surfaces exposed to the elements over long periods. These walls carry thousands of petroglyphs, images pecked or carved into the rock by various peoples over many centuries. But among the well-known deeply carved petroglyphs, researchers began documenting another category of rock imagery that had been largely overlooked: finely scratched images, sometimes called incised petroglyphs or scratched rock art, made not by pecking away the dark surface to reveal lighter rock beneath, but by scratching thin lines into the surface. These images are far less visible than traditional petroglyphs. They are shallow. They do not contrast strongly with the surrounding rock. Under most lighting conditions, they are nearly invisible. Many had been overlooked entirely by earlier surveyors, or were partially obscured by later graffiti, carved names, and inscriptions left by 19th and 20th century visitors. When researchers began systematically recording these faint images, the subjects they found were striking: mounted riders on horseback, teepees, figures carrying weapons, scenes that appeared to depict confrontations, raids, or pursuits. The imagery was consistent with Plains Indian artistic traditions, and specifically with the presence of Comanche groups in the region. The Comanches were a powerful and wide-ranging people whose territory and raiding activity extended deep into New Mexico, particularly during the 18th and early 19th centuries. Their presence is well documented in Spanish colonial records, in accounts from other indigenous nations, and in the oral traditions of Pueblo communities who experienced Comanche raids. But physical archaeological evidence of Comanche presence in specific locations is often sparse. They were a mobile people. They did not build permanent stone structures. Their camps were temporary. The material traces they left behind were light and easily erased by time. The scratched rock art of the Rio Grande Gorge changed that picture. Here was direct physical evidence of Comanche activity, created by the people themselves, showing their horses, their camps, and their conflicts, preserved on the very cliffs where they passed. And it had been almost invisible. Dating scratched rock art is notoriously difficult. Unlike deeply pecked petroglyphs, where researchers can sometimes estimate age from the degree of repatination, that is, how much the exposed lighter rock has redarkened over time, scratched images are so shallow that repatination analysis is unreliable. Researchers instead rely on the content of the images, particularly the presence of horses, which places the art after roughly 1600 CE, when horses became available to Plains peoples, and comparison with known Comanche artistic conventions documented in other media. Associated archaeological evidence, including the identification of nearby campsites with material culture consistent with Comanche occupation, strengthens the interpretation. It would be a mistake to treat every scratched figure as a literal depiction of one specific historical raid or battle. Rock art is not a newspaper. Some images may record real events. Others may be symbolic, commemorative, or ritual in nature. But taken as a body of evidence, the scratched images of the Rio Grande Gorge preserve a record of Comanche presence, activity, and conflict in northern New Mexico that complements, and in some cases extends, the written historical record. The fact that this record was almost invisible to modern observers, hidden in plain sight on cliffs that thousands of tourists visit every year, is itself a lesson in how much can be missed when we only look for the things we already expect to find. That idea, that entire chapters of history can hide in landscapes we think we already understand, brings us to the last discovery, and this one might be the most visually striking of all. Blue Jay is an ancestral Puebloan settlement site in northwestern New Mexico, in the general region south of Chaco Canyon. On the surface, the site does not look like much. There are subtle rises in the terrain, slight variations in vegetation, scattered ceramic fragments. An experienced archaeologist walking the ground might suspect that buried structures exist below the surface, but identifying and mapping them through surface observation alone would be slow, uncertain, and incomplete. In a study led by researchers including Jesse Casana at Dartmouth College, a drone equipped with a thermal infrared camera was flown over the Blue Jay site. The flights were timed carefully, conducted during periods when temperature differences between buried architectural features and the surrounding soil would be greatest, typically in the early morning or late evening, when the ground is heating or cooling, and materials with different thermal properties change temperature at different rates. The principle is straightforward. Stone walls, even when buried under soil, retain and conduct heat differently than the surrounding earth. A buried stone wall will typically warm more slowly and cool more slowly than loose fill or undisturbed soil. In the thermal images captured by the drone, these temperature differences appear as subtle patterns, lines, rectangles, and room-shaped features that are completely invisible in ordinary photographs or to the naked eye. The results at Blue Jay were remarkable. The thermal imagery revealed a complex of architectural features beneath the surface, room blocks, walls, and structural outlines that mapped out significant portions of the buried settlement. The drone survey accomplished in hours what would have taken weeks or months of surface survey and test excavation, and it did so without disturbing the ground at all. This last point matters enormously. Excavation is destructive. Every trowelful of soil removed from an archaeological site is a trowelful that can never be put back exactly as it was. The spatial relationships between objects, layers, and features, what archaeologists call context, are destroyed in the process of recording them. Non-invasive survey methods like thermal imaging allow researchers to understand the layout of a site before deciding where or whether to excavate. In regions like the American Southwest, where thousands of archaeological sites remain unexcavated and many are threatened by erosion, development, and climate change, the ability to map buried architecture quickly and without digging is transformative. But thermal imaging is not a perfect oracle. A thermal anomaly that looks like a wall might be a wall. It might also be a natural variation in soil density, a buried geological feature, or a root system. The technique reveals patterns that are consistent with architecture, but confirmation still requires ground truthing, whether through limited excavation, ground-penetrating radar, or other geophysical methods. The thermal map is a hypothesis, rendered in color, not a blueprint. What makes the Blue Jay study so compelling is not that it answered every question about the site, it is the image itself. An ancient settlement, centuries old, buried and invisible, suddenly appearing in false color on a screen because someone flew a camera overhead that could see what human eyes could not. It is a reminder that archaeology is not only about digging, sometimes it is about learning to see what was there all along. And now, pull the lens back. Look at all of this together. A set of footprints older than any model predicted, left in mud beside the tracks of animals that no longer exist. A road built with a ruler's precision across 50 miles of desert, pointing toward a destination that may not be a place you can walk to. A calendar built from nothing but sunlight and stone. Pottery created with extraordinary skill, then deliberately destroyed and buried with the dead. A mining landscape that fueled a continental trade network, operated entirely with stone tools. A well dug 13,500 years ago, possibly by people who never found the water they were looking for. Classified military debris that launched the most famous alien story in history, even though the explanation involves balloon-borne microphones listening for Soviet nuclear explosions. Rock drawings so faint they were invisible for decades, preserving a record of warfare and survival. And a settlement that could only be seen from the sky, by a camera that reads heat instead of light. None of these stories require aliens, lost civilizations, supernatural forces, or conspiracy theories. They require something more unsettling than any of those. The admission that the real past was far more complex, more creative, more ambitious, and more human than the simple version we were taught. And New Mexico, sitting quietly in the desert, has been holding the evidence the whole time. What discovery surprised you the most? And which one do you think deserves its own full video? Tell me in the comments, because I have a feeling we have only scratched the surface. And considering how much was hiding in plain sight at every single one of these locations, that might be literally true.